The morning everything changed, I remember how cold the sand felt under my feet that morning. The sun had not come up yet, and the beach was that gray-blue color everything gets just before dawn. Daniel was 20 feet ahead of me, walking slowly toward the southern rocks. Neither of us was talking. At first I thought the dark patches scattered across the wet sand were pieces of seaweed. There had been a storm offshore the night before, so it made sense. But as the light improved, the shapes became clearer. They were red. Not bright red. Dark, almost brown in places, with fresher streaks closer to the rocks. Blood had collected inside footprints, soaked into shallow depressions, and smeared across stones near the waterline. Long marks ran toward the surf, where each wave was already washing part of them away. Daniel stopped suddenly. "Don't come any closer." I looked past him and saw something lying beside the rocks. I couldn't tell what it was from where I stood. Looking back, that should not have been our first warning. It wasn't. We had been getting warnings for almost 2 days. The problem was that every one had a reasonable explanation. Nothing seemed dangerous until all of it did. And it started because Daniel wanted to revisit the place our father used to bring us. The place our father used to bring us, my father, started bringing Daniel and me to that stretch of coast when we were teenagers. We went almost every summer, usually for 3 or 4 days. And always somewhere cheap enough that Dad could complain about the mattress without feeling guilty about the price. He was not a sentimental man. He never talked about making memories or spending quality time together. He liked fishing, bad diner coffee, old roadside motels, and places where nobody could reach him unless they really tried. Back then, that usually meant somewhere with weak cell service and a bait shop within driving distance. After he died, Daniel called me and suggested we go back. I told him no the first time. Our father had been sick for a while, but the end still came faster than I expected. Daniel had stayed close to home during those last few years. I had moved several hours away for work, and even though I visited, it was never enough to satisfy either of us. Daniel never said that directly, but I knew he thought I should have been there more. For my part, I thought he had turned Dad's illness into something he controlled. Appointments, medications, decisions, phone calls. If I asked a question, Daniel already had an answer. If I suggested something, he had usually considered it first. We never fought about it openly, so that almost made it worse. So when he asked again about the coast, I finally agreed, mostly because saying no twice felt childish. The drive down was quiet for the first hour. We talked about traffic, gas prices, and whether the weather would hold. Nothing important. At a grocery store near the highway, we bought sandwich meat, coffee, bottled water, cheap beer, and a box of the same saltine crackers Dad used to keep in the car. Daniel held them up and said, "These still taste like cardboard." I said, he liked them. He liked bad things. That was about as close as we came to talking about him. Daniel had also brought Dad's old tackle box. The metal hinges were orange with rust, and half the lures inside were probably useless. But he set it carefully in the back seat like it mattered. The cabin we rented sat above a narrow cove about 10 minutes from the main road. It smelled faintly of damp wood and whatever cleaner the owner used between guests. One bedroom had an ancient television that only picked up 2 channels clearly, and our phones moved between one bar and no service at all. It felt familiar in a way I had not expected. There were a few houses farther up the road, and belonged to an older man with a black Labrador whose muzzle had gone mostly gray. The dog wandered past the cabin twice that afternoon, moving slowly and sniffing at the ditch before heading home. That first evening, Daniel and I cooked hamburgers outside on a small propane grill. He insisted Dad had always used charcoal. I told him he was remembering a different trip. He said. He hated propane. He hated waiting for charcoal. We argued for maybe 30 seconds, then both started laughing because neither of us actually knew. That was the first time the trip felt normal. From the deck, you could see most of the cove. The public beach and a cluster of houses sat to the north. To the south, dark cliffs curved out toward the water and cut off about half a mile of shoreline. At low tide, you could walk around the rocks. At high tide, the water came almost all the way to the cliff. Daniel pointed toward that end of the beach and said, "Dad used to warn us never to get trapped there when the tide came in." Remembered. At the time, it was just another old family memory. Near dusk, we sat outside with beers while the light faded over the water. That was when I noticed a small boat farther offshore. Daniel looked at it and said it was probably some kind of fishing vessel. I did not think much of it. There was no music playing, no engine noise reaching us, nothing that made me curious enough to stand up and watch it more closely from there. Then, almost an hour later, I looked again. It had barely moved. Little things we explained away. The barking started sometime after midnight. At first I tried to ignore it. The cabin was warm. The window beside my bed was cracked open, and I was tired enough that I thought I could fall back asleep. But the dog kept going. It was not the excited barking you hear when a dog sees a raccoon or another dog across the road. These were short, sharp bursts, separated by a few seconds of silence. Every time it started again, it sounded like it was facing the water. I got out of bed and looked through the window. There was nothing to see. The cove was completely dark, and the porch lights from the houses farther north did not reach the beach below us. I could barely make out the pale line where the water met the sand. Then I heard an engine. It was faint and somewhere offshore. The sound lasted maybe 20 seconds, then stopped. I stood there listening, but it did not come back. I gave it the easiest explanation. Someone checking crab pots, someone fishing late, maybe the same boat we had seen before sunset. The next morning, Daniel looked at me over his coffee and said, "You still sleep like somebody is breaking into the house." I told him about the dog. He shrugged. "Probably a deer." We went down to the beach after breakfast with Dad's tackle box between us. The tide was low enough that we could walk toward the southern rocks without getting our shoes wet. Near the cliff, Daniel found a piece of rope half buried in the sand. It was thick, heavier than anything we used for fishing, and looked newer than the usual junk that washed ashore. One end was frayed. The other looked clean, like somebody had cut it with a knife. Daniel turned it over. Boat line, maybe? Then he dropped it. Farther along, we found a plastic storage tote with one corner cracked. The lid was gone. Daniel kicked it lightly with his boot and looked inside. Empty. That was it. We did not discuss either thing again. Round 10, we drove into town for breakfast. There was a diner near the harbor that Dad used to like, mostly because they refilled coffee before you had to ask. Afterward, Daniel wanted to stop at the old marine supply store. The building was still there, but the man behind the counter was not someone either of us remembered. Introduced himself as Tom Mercer. He was probably in his 50s, broad-shouldered, with a gray beard trimmed close to his face. Daniel bought some hooks and asked if people still fished the cove south of the rental cabins. Tom paused. "Which cove?" Daniel described it. Something in Tom's expression changed, but only slightly. "Not much at night," he said. "Too many rocks close to shore." Then he looked at us and asked, "How long you boys staying?" Daniel said 3 nights. Tom nodded and went back to sorting a box of sinkers. There was nothing openly strange about the conversation, but I remember feeling relieved when we walked outside. That afternoon, we finally met the owner of the Labrador. His name was Ed Collins. He was in his late 60s, retired from the local school district, and spoke with the friendliness of someone who had nowhere else to be. He apologized for the barking. Daniel asked if coyotes came through often. Sometimes, Ed said, but Duke doesn't care about coyotes. He glanced toward the beach. He's been doing that 3 nights now. I think somebody's walking down there after dark. Have you seen anyone? I asked. Ed shook his head, not clearly. I figured he was probably hearing fishermen, teenagers, or tourists and letting his imagination fill in the rest. That evening, Daniel found something under the cabin stairs. It was a torn strip of orange waterproof fabric, stiff with salt and sand. It looked like part of a commercial rain jacket. "Previous renters?" Daniel said. I tossed it onto the porch railing. Looking back, that was probably the first real clue sitting directly in front of us. We just had no reason to know what it meant. The boat without lights by the second evening. I had mostly stopped thinking about the barking dog, the rope, and the conversation with Tom Mercer. That is the strange part when I look back on it. None of those things felt connected yet. They were separate little moments, each easy enough to explain on its own. Daniel and I walked down to the beach before sunset with 2 rods and a small cooler. The tide was coming in slowly, and the water was calm enough that the surface looked almost flat beyond the rocks. That was when I saw the boat again. It was much closer than the night before. I pointed it out, and Daniel dug through Dad's old fishing bag until he found the binoculars. The rubber around one eyepiece was cracked, but they still worked. He watched for maybe 30 seconds. 2 guys, he said. Then he adjusted the focus. Maybe 3? I asked if they were fishing. Daniel lowered the binoculars. Doesn't look like it. We stayed there another 40 minutes. As the light faded, I glanced toward the boat again and realized I could no longer see it. I assumed it had headed out. Then the engine started. The sound came from the same part of the cove. Daniel looked at me. The boat was still there, moving slowly through the dark without the lights I expected to see on a vessel after sunset. That's weird, he said. It was the first time he had said it plainly. For a few seconds, we just stood there listening. I remember searching the water for a red or green navigation light and seeing nothing. Even then, I was not frightened. I mostly felt embarrassed for paying so much attention to strangers on a boat. Daniel, though, kept watching the darkness long after I looked away. We packed up soon after. On the walk back, Daniel noticed fresh tire tracks cutting across the dirt near the southern cliff. They led toward an old maintenance road I remembered from years earlier. A rusted metal gate usually blocked it. Now the gate stood partly open. Daniel stopped. Want to see where that goes? No, he smiled like I was being difficult. You're not curious? I'm curious about lots of things I don't need to walk toward. That was Daniel. If something did not make sense, he wanted to get closer until it did. I had always been the opposite. I was perfectly comfortable letting other people's problems stay other people's problems. We headed back toward the cabin. Halfway up the road, headlights appeared behind us. A vehicle had stopped near the turnoff. It did not come closer. For maybe 30 seconds, the headlights stayed fixed in our direction. Then they moved backward and disappeared. Probably looking for one of the rentals, I said. Daniel did not answer. Later, when we went inside for the night, I heard the front door click. Daniel had locked it. He had not bothered doing that the night before. Something came ashore. The barking woke me a little after 2 in the morning. This time I was not the first one awake. Daniel was already standing near the window in the living room, one hand pulling the curtain back just enough to look outside. The cabin was dark, except for the green numbers on the microwave clock. What is it? I whispered. He held up a hand. At first, all I could hear was Duke barking somewhere near the road. Then another sound came through the open window. Voices. They were faint and low, coming from the beach below us. I could not make out any words, but there were at least 2 men talking. One voice sounded close to the cliff. The other answered from farther away. Daniel leaned nearer to the glass. Then we heard something scrape across the gravel below. It was slow and heavy. Not footsteps, more like something being dragged. A few seconds later, an engine started near the maintenance road. Daniel moved toward the back door. I'm going to look from the deck. No, he turned toward me. We can stay inside and still look. No, Daniel. If they're down there doing something, I don't want them knowing we're awake. For once, he did not argue much. We stood there listening until the engine faded. The voices stopped. Duke barked twice more, then everything went quiet. Neither of us really slept after that. Around 4:30, I smelled coffee. Daniel was in the kitchen, dressed already. Want to fish early? I looked at him. You want to see what was down there? He poured coffee into a chipped mug. That too. I should have said no. Instead, I got dressed. When we opened the front door, Duke was sitting beside the steps. His paws were wet and covered in dark mud. There was something around his muzzle, too, almost black in the porch light. I crouched down. Where have you been? Duke looked past me toward the beach. Daniel rubbed his thumb along the dog's muzzle and held it up. The smear looked reddish. Rust? I said. Maybe neither of us said blood. Not yet. The air outside had that damp smell you'd get near the ocean before sunrise. Nothing was moving on the road. Ed's house was dark, and for a moment I wondered whether we should wake him and tell him his dog had gotten loose. Daniel said Duke knew his way home. I remember agreeing because it was easier than knocking on a door before 5 in the morning. We started toward the wooden staircase, expecting Duke to follow. He usually wandered anywhere people went. He did not move. When Daniel called him, the dog stood, took 2 steps forward, then stopped again. A low whine came from his throat. That bothered me more than the voices had. Still, we kept going. The first broken piece of plastic was halfway down the stairs. It was clear and sharp, like part of a storage container or lid. A few steps lower, there was another piece. At the bottom, Daniel stopped. A blue rubber glove lay beside the railing. 10 feet farther down the sand was another one. Neither looked old enough to have washed up with the usual beach trash. Daniel stared at them for a moment. He did not make a joke this time. The beach itself looked completely normal. The sky was beginning to turn gray. The tide was low. Small waves folded quietly onto the sand, and several gulls moved along the waterline, pecking at things the tide had left behind. For a few seconds, I felt foolish for being nervous. Then Daniel walked ahead of me and stopped. There was a dark streak in the wet sand near his feet. First I thought it was seaweed. Then I saw another one farther down the beach, and another beyond that. The shoreline was covered in blood. Daniel stared at the first streak, then crouched beside it. "Could be a seal," he said. I wanted that to be true badly enough that I almost accepted it. A wounded animal made sense. Seals came close to shore sometimes. Deer wandered down from the trees. Anything was better than the thought forming in my mind. But the farther we walked, the harder that explanation became. The morning light was weak, but strong enough now to show color. What had looked black from a distance was dark red. Some had collected in shallow footprints near the waterline. Smaller droplets continued along the wet sand, spaced unevenly as if someone had been moving while injured. Then we saw the larger smears. They were farther from the water, where the sand was softer. One patch had been dragged across several feet in a wide streak. Another covered the side of a low rock. There were shoe prints everywhere, some clear, others overlapping until they became impossible to separate. Daniel stopped again. "No, that's too much for a seal," I did not answer. One trail of prints moved in a straight line toward the southern rocks. Another wandered beside it, changing direction every few steps. Heel marks were deeper than the toes in places, then reversed. It looked like someone had been struggling to stay upright. Beside those was a long groove in the sand. Something heavy had been dragged south. That was the moment I became genuinely afraid. Until then, part of me had been treating everything like a strange beach discovery, something we would tell somebody about later. Now I was looking at the scene and thinking about the voices we had heard ours earlier. Daniel pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. "What are you doing? If the tide comes in, this is gone." He was right. Waves were already reaching some of the blood closer to the water and thinning it into red clouds before pulling it back out. He tried calling emergency services. The call failed. He walked inland, held the phone above his head, and tried again. Nothing. "We go back to the cabin," I said. "Call from the road." Daniel nodded, but then he looked toward the rocks. Something orange was wedged between two of them. He went over and pulled it free. It was waterproof fabric. For a second, neither of us spoke. I knew exactly why. The torn strip Daniel had found beneath our cabin stairs was the same shade of orange, the same stiff material, even the same reflective silver line near one edge. Daniel looked back toward the cabin above us. Whatever had happened on that beach had not started as far away from us as I wanted to believe. We moved another 20 yards before finding the watch. It had a cracked face and a broken metal band. Farther on was a wallet lying open in the sand. There were damp bills inside and 2 empty card slots, but no identification. Then Daniel stopped beside something near the edge of the surf. It was a work boot. Heavy black rubber, the kind fishermen wear. There was blood inside it. There was no foot. "I'm done," I said. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. "Achille." Daniel did not argue. He put the orange fabric down and turned back toward me. Then we heard coughing. It came from beyond the rocks to the south. We both froze. Several seconds there was nothing except the water. Then it came again. A wet, weak cough. After that, a voice. We could not understand the words. Daniel started moving. Daniel. He kept going. I followed because there was no chance I was letting him disappear around those rocks alone. The tide was low enough to pass, but the sand narrowed near the cliff. We stepped around a boulder and found him immediately. A man was lying against the base of the cliff, half hidden behind loose stones and beach grass. He was alive, barely. His face was pale, and his breathing came in short, uneven pulls. One side of his clothing was soaked dark. I could not tell how badly he was hurt, only that he needed help quickly. He wore waterproof fishing clothes. The jacket was orange. Near the bottom, a piece had been torn away. Daniel knelt beside him, recalling an ambulance. The man's eyes opened. His hand moved suddenly and closed around Daniel's wrist. "Don't," he whispered. Daniel leaned closer. "What?" The man swallowed, struggling to get the words out. "Don't call anyone from the marina. Not the police, not an ambulance, marina." Before either of us could ask why, an engine started somewhere above the cliff. Gravel cracked beneath tires. A vehicle had just entered the maintenance road. The men who came back the engine above us stayed running for a few seconds, then cut off. Daniel looked toward the cliff. I looked at the man on the ground. There was no way we were getting him up that slope. Even if he could stand, which he clearly could not, the path was loose gravel and wet rock. The tide was coming in too. Water that had been several yards from us 10 minutes earlier was already pushing farther up the sand. I tried my phone again. One bar appeared, disappeared, then came back. The call connected. I set our location as quickly as I could. I told the dispatcher there was an injured man on the beach and that I thought he had been assaulted. She asked me to repeat the address. Then the call dropped. I stared at the screen. "Did they get it?" Daniel asked. "I don't know. Above us we heard footsteps on gravel." 2 sets. The injured man heard them too. His breathing changed immediately. He tried to sit up and almost collapsed. "They came back," he said. Daniel leaned closer. "Who?" The man shook his head like he was trying to clear it. "Boat." He pointed weakly toward the cove. "The boat." He nodded. What followed came out in pieces. He worked on the vessel we had seen offshore. They'd been bringing stolen marine equipment and other cargo into the cove at night, using the maintenance road to move it inland. Something had gone wrong during the unloading. An argument started. One crewman hit another. Then somebody used a metal bar. The injured man tried to stop it and got hit too. He remembered falling into shallow water, crawling toward the rocks, hearing someone dragging the other injured man across the beach. That explained the blood. Not one victim. More than one. For a second, neither of us said anything. I kept thinking about how ordinary the beach had looked from the cabin. Same water, the same rocks, the same narrow strip of sand we had walked as kids. Now every detail seemed different because we finally understood that people had been using it while everyone nearby was asleep. The fishermen kept glancing toward the path above us, not like someone expecting help, but like someone waiting for the worst person possible to appear down there again. The footsteps were closer now. Daniel looked at me. "Get him farther back." "What are you going to do?" "Keep them looking at me." I hated the idea, but we did not have time to argue. I got under the fisherman's arm and helped drag him deeper behind the rocks. He was heavier than I expected, and every movement made him gasp through his teeth. Daniel stayed near the opening. 2 men came around the rocks a few moments later. I could only see parts of them from where I was crouched. One was the man from the marine supply store, Tom Mercer. He recognized Daniel too. "You boys find something?" His voice was calm. It somehow made it worse. Daniel shook his head. "It's fishing." Tom looked toward the blood on the sand, then at Daniel's sleeve. There was a dark smear near his elbow from helping the injured man. "What happened there?" Daniel glanced down. "Seal?" Tom did not answer. The second man was younger, maybe 35, wearing a dark hooded jacket. He looked past Daniel toward the rocks. Nobody moved for several seconds. Then Duke started barking from above the beach. The sound exploded through the silence. A moment later, I heard Ed shouting his name from somewhere near the road. The younger man turned toward the cliff. I took my phone out again. 1 bar. I moved several feet toward the water and called. This time, the dispatcher answered immediately. I spoke quietly at first, then louder when she asked me to repeat myself. That was when Tom looked past Daniel and saw me. The younger man started toward me. Daniel stepped in front of him. Everything after that happened badly and fast. There was no clean fight. The younger man shoved Daniel. Daniel grabbed his jacket. He stumbled into the sand together, and Tom yelled something I did not understand. The younger man swung once and caught Daniel near the side of the head. Daniel went down. I backed toward the water with the phone still in my hand. The dispatcher was asking what was happening. Tom looked toward the road. Then we all heard sirens. Faint at first, but getting closer. Tom grabbed the younger man's shoulder. "Leave it!" The younger man hesitated. Now, they ran back toward the maintenance road. Seconds later, an engine started above us. Another engine answered from offshore. The boat began moving out of the cove. I went straight to Daniel. He was sitting up, dazed but conscious. Together, we stayed with the fishermen until responders came down the beach. Only after the paramedics reached us did I notice Daniel's hands. They were covered in blood. For several seconds, I could not tell whose it was. What actually happened that night, by the time the police reached the beach, the whole cove felt different. They blocked the stairs, closed the maintenance road, and kept everyone away from the southern rocks. Paramedics took the injured fisherman out first. Daniel needed stitches above his ear, but otherwise he was okay. The fisherman survived. Over the next few days, investigators filled in the parts we had only seen from the outside. The boat was tied to a small theft operation that had been hitting marinas, storage sheds, and unattended docks along the coast. They were taking tools, electronics, engines, and whatever else could be moved quickly and sold later. The cove was one of their transfer points. It was isolated, hard to see from the road, and easy to reach by boat if you knew where the submerged rocks were. That night, something inside the group finally broke down. During the unloading, an argument turned violent. One man was badly injured and tried to make it toward the houses. Another collapsed closer to the water. The fisherman we found had tried to intervene, was attacked himself, and escaped toward the rocks. That was why the blood trails made no sense when we first saw them. There had been more than one person bleeding. Police believed the orange fabric under our cabin stairs had probably torn from the fisherman's jacket during an earlier trip to check the area. The rope, the empty tote, the open gate, the boat moving without lights, the voices at night, even Duke barking toward the beach, none of it was mysterious anymore. That is the part that stayed with me. Every warning had an ordinary explanation. We just did not have enough information to put them together. Tom Mercer was arrested not long after. The younger man disappeared for several days before police found him in another coastal town. Once I knew the full story, I kept thinking about how close we had been to it without understanding anything. We had been sleeping above that beach while all of it was happening below us, less than 100 yards from us. Daniel and I never talked about the blood. We stayed near the coast for 3 more days after the police finished questioning us. Neither of us suggested going home early. Daniel had a bandage above his ear, and I had bruises from helping move the fishermen. We spent those days quietly. Coffee in the morning, takeout at night, quiet drives. We still did not talk much about Dad. There were things between us that one frightening morning could not fix. I still believed Daniel had shut me out during Dad's illness. I knew he still believed I had not been there enough. But something had changed. When that man hit Daniel and he went down in the sand, none of that mattered. I was not thinking about old arguments, missed calls, or who had been right. I was thinking that I had already lost my father. I could not lose my brother too. On the last morning, Daniel carried Dad's tackle box to my car and put it in the trunk. "You keep it," he said. That was all. I almost told him he should have it. Instead, I closed the trunk. It was the closest we came to saying what neither of us knew how to say. The part I still think about years later, the part I remember, is not the fight on the beach. It is not the police arriving, or the ambulance, or even the fishermen lying against the rocks. It is the few minutes before all of that. When the shoreline was slowly becoming visible in the morning light, and I still did not understand what I was looking at, that is what stays with me. I think frightening things are imagined as sudden. A door breaks open. Someone screams. Something happens that leaves no room for doubt. But what happened to us did not begin that way. It began with a dog barking after midnight, an engine somewhere offshore, a gate that should have been closed, a piece of orange fabric under a staircase. Small things you notice, question for a second, and then explain away, because that is what people do. Most of the time, the harmless explanation is the right one. Since then, I have gone back to that part of the coast more than once. I have never gone back to that cove. Daniel has asked me twice. Both times I found a reason not to go. Work weather. Too much driving for one weekend. He knows those are excuses. The strange thing is, I do not think the beach itself scares me. That is exactly why I avoid it. If I went back tomorrow, it would probably look the same. Gray water, wet sand, dark rocks, the wooden stairs above the cove. It would look like the place our father brought us when we were kids. I think that is the part I still cannot get past. The worst thing was not finding something horrible in a place we did not know. It was finding it somewhere we had always believed was safe.